So last lecture, I said that Aristotle thought that the good life was one of virtuous activity. You acquire these virtues, these traits of character, and you put them into action. You have an occasion, you have a chance to practice the virtues. Well, what are the virtues, right? They're good traits of character, but that probably doesn't tell you that much. I'm not going to give you guys Aristotle's list of virtues just yet, but I could reel off the list: courage, generosity, honesty. But it still doesn't really give you an idea of what sort of thing a virtue is. And that's what I want to talk about in this lecture and the next before we really even get into detail about Aristotle's list of specific virtues. And I also, in this lecture and the next, I want to talk about the objection I talked about last time, that the virtues might not be pleasant for the person who has them, that it might not be fun, it might not be pleasurable to do the right thing. Pleasure is valuable, so a virtuous life will have to be pleasurable if Aristotle is right that it is a good answer to this question, what eudaimonia is. So how is he going to answer, well, this it might be not so pleasant to be virtuous objection? Aristotle has an answer, but I think we're going to have to see what his theory is before we see what the answer is. Or sorry, what we see what his concept of the virtues is before we see what his answer to that is. Okay. So what are virtues? Well, Aristotle will say, they're not just traits of character, they're like skills. Having a virtue is like being able to dance or throw a curveball or, cook or something like that. Aristotle will think that having these virtues, having these skills is what it is that allows us to do the right thing. Kant will think, Mill thought in terms of consequences. Kant and the natural law theory thought in terms of rules. Aristotle will say none of them are right about that. It's all about skills. Well, virtues aren't quite exactly skills, but I think this is a useful way to think that they're like them. We'll see in a minute how they're not exactly like skills, but for the most part, that's a useful enough way to think about the virtues. Virtues allow you to do something, to act well. Aristotle will say another mark of the virtues is that they're good for the person who has them. If something's bad for you, it can't be a real virtue. Remember, the good life is going to be one of virtuous, excellent activity. So, well, if the virtues were bad for you, that just wouldn't fit with Aristotle's answer. Now, I said the virtues are like skills. They are ways of doing something, ways of doing the morally right thing. But Aristotle will say, unlike skills, the difference between virtues and skills, the way they differ, is that virtues reliably lead you to do the right thing. They're linked to doing the right thing in a way that skills aren't. And remember, this is the kind of point Kant was making, right? If I have a skill, if I am an excellent shot, I can use that for all kinds of morally innocent things. I can go target shooting. I might even use it for something morally good. Or I could use it to kill someone, right? A doctor who knows a lot about poisons, he could use that skill to cure people. He could also use that skill to kill people without getting caught, right? Aristotle will say this is how the virtues differ from skills. Skills can be misused. They're not necessarily linked with doing the right thing. Virtues can't be. They are linked to doing the right thing. One other thing that's important to know about the virtues is that they involve not just acting the right way, not just doing the right thing, but feeling the right way about it. If you really have the virtues, if you are, say, courageous, it's not just that you stand up to danger, you feel the right way about standing up to danger. And that makes sense, right? The really courageous person probably wouldn't be someone who's terrified all the time of everything, right? Okay, so keep these points in mind as we go more deeply into Aristotle's account of the virtues. Well, I think this claim that virtues involve not just doing the right thing, but feeling the right way about it, I think that gives us, or gives Aristotle, a partial answer to this virtue might be unpleasant challenge. Aristotle will say, if being virtuous makes you miserable, then you aren't really virtuous. Take generosity, right? Imagine, go back to my example, if your relative needed some money from you. Look, you can imagine being someone who's just like, nope, I'm going to dodge his calls. I'm going to pretend that I don't know about this. He ain't getting a cent of my money, right? Not going to happen. Not a penny. Or, and hopefully we would all be in this second category, you, or at least in the second category, you might think, yeah, I really don't want to give it to him. God, I hate this, but I will do it. I'll do it. Would really like to spend this money on a vacation or something else. I'll give him the money. I might even try to pretend to be happy to do it, but I really hate giving him this money. Or you might think of someone who's like, well, he needs it more than I do. I am just really glad to be able to help out. And Aristotle would say, look, we all know the first guy, the guy who doesn't want to do it and doesn't do it, is bad. But here's the thing. Who do you think is better? The person who grudgingly gives it and probably grumbles to himself afterwards, who hates doing it, or the person who's glad to help? Aristotle would say it's the person who's glad to help. Only that last person, Aristotle would say, is really a generous person. Now, the middle guy, the guy who helps but doesn't want to, he's not bad. He's not as bad as the person who just ignores it. But he's not good either. Or he's not as good as he could be. Aristotle will say, if you really have the virtue, not only do you do the right thing, you enjoy doing it. The virtuous person enjoys being virtuous. If you don't enjoy it, if you don't enjoy giving, you're not really generous. Well, then, what are you? Aristotle will actually say that human character comes in a whole range, kind of a spectrum, right? All the way at the really bad end, we have vice. At the other end, we have virtue. Now, the person who doesn't enjoy giving, but gives, Aristotle would say, well, he's not all the way at the bad side. He's not vicious. Doesn't have a vice. He's not virtuous either. What is he? He's what Aristotle calls continent. What does that mean? Aristotle will say you might picture 4 sorts of people. There are people who have a vice. There are vicious people. Vicious people do the wrong thing and feel the wrong way about it. In my example of a relative who needs money, they probably think, yeah, stinks to be him. He deserves it. He's not getting any of my money, right? They might even feel secretly happy that he's suffering and they're not. That is a truly vicious person. The vicious person does the wrong thing and feels the wrong way about it. Might, take a vicious person who's a coward. He runs away and he pats himself on the back for avoiding danger. He probably thinks all the brave people who face danger are idiots. Incontinence is a little better. The incontinent person, like the truly vicious person, usually does the wrong thing. But he sometimes feels bad about it or ashamed. If you've ever seen, this kind of a stock character in the movie, Lex Luthor or whatever villain always has some sidekick who kind of feels bad about trying to kill Superman or whatever, right? He doesn't stop him usually, but he feels kind of bad about it, right? Well, this person is incontinent. He knows on some level he shouldn't do it. He does, but he feels a little bad about it. Continent person usually does the right thing, but sometimes, maybe even often, feels the wrong way about it. In my case, the person who gives money to the relative in need but doesn't like doing it is continent. He does the right thing, and he does the right thing because he should. He doesn't like it. He doesn't feel the right way about it. Virtue, the virtuous person not only reliably or usually does the right thing, he or she feels the right way about it. He gives the money, and he's glad to help. Now, one other thing, and I want to go back to the last slide because I think this, not that this is a great little graphic, but I think it's important to notice. These are not just, you're not just necessarily one place, one of four places on here. Aristotle would say there's a whole long line, and we'll divide up segments of it we might call incontinence, segments continence. Look, wherever you fall on the line, if you're close enough to virtue, you might not have to be all the way to the right. We'll call it virtuous, but you might be able to do better, right? The person who almost always feels the right way about it, but every now and then doesn't, we would probably say, or Aristotle would say, he's virtuous. He's not perfectly virtuous. He could be more virtuous. The person who sometimes feels the right way about it, sometimes doesn't, well, he's probably on the upper end of continence, maybe even toward virtue, but he's probably still more toward continence, right? There might be a person who always feels wrong about doing the bad thing, but sometimes does the wrong thing, sometimes does the right thing. He might be on the sort of left end of continence or the right end of incontinence or somewhere in between. Keep in mind there's a whole line here, and Aristotle would say you can fall just about anywhere on it. Now, I think this gives us an interesting way to think about characters like Mr. Rogers who were better than the most of us, right? We might say that these really saintly people are really far toward the right end of the spectrum. Maybe not you, but at least me, I would say, I'm not definitely toward the really far to the right. But people who are, I don't think I'm a bad person, but I admit there are people who are better than me, right? And Aristotle would say that's because, you can be a decent person even if you're not fully virtuous. Continent people are decent, but people who are more virtuous than you are better. And that might be what we say, people like Fred Rogers or Gandhi or the Bedots or Amti, they're more virtuous than we are, even if we're not bad people. And I think this is interesting because, for Kant, for natural law theory, it's all black and white. Respect or don't respect. For utilitarianism, it's the same way. It's either you maximize happiness or you don't. Virtue theory is interesting because it can say that, actual moral characters come in shades of gray, right? We might not be a bad person, but we might not be particularly virtuous either, right? Think of three characters, right? Somebody drops his groceries in a parking lot. You might think of one person who points and laughs, like Nelson from The Simpsons, ha ha, that would be the vicious person. You might think of someone who is in a hurry and they feel a little bad, so they don't help and they go on, right? That would probably be someone who's incontinent. You might think of someone who helps and is glad to help. That would be a virtuous person. Or you might even add a fourth person, somebody who doesn't want to help, but, if they're close enough, they do, right? Again, somebody like that is not a bad person, but there's the thought that the person who just springs into action and helps this person is better, is more virtuous. Aristotle will say that it's not black or white, it's not 1 or 0. This shades all the way from really terrible vice all the way to almost superhuman or godlike virtue. We should try to want to get further down the line, closer to virtue, but Aristotle would say we're not blameworthy, we're not bad, as long as we're not shading toward vice here. So I think it's interesting, this worry that Kantianism, utilitarianism don't give us a language to talk about exceptionally good people. Well, virtue theory might do a bit better. All right. Well, how is it that we come to feel the right way about doing something? Remember, Kant said, well, we can't control what we feel. So defining the good person, the good will in terms of feelings, no, you can't do that. Aristotle will say, no, that's too quick. Aristotle will say being virtuous is a matter of habituation. You need to do the right thing over and over and to practice doing the right thing before you really come to have the virtue. Think of what I said, that virtues are like skills. To really pick up any skill, even as something as simple as, knowing how to chop vegetables really well. These chefs that can do it just automatically in a second. The first time you try to chop something up, you're not going to do it that well. You might even cut your finger. You're going to be way slower. So the same goes for virtues. To really have them, you have to practice, you have to work over time. And Aristotle will say part of that work is that over time you come to feel the right way about doing it. Think about it this way. Think about the first time you ever had to be generous. First time your mom or dad told you, hey, you need to share with this other kid. I'm betting you didn't like it. You probably only did it because your parents guilted you into it, or there was some kind of unspoken threat, right? But you do it over and over, and it gets easier. You probably don't like it the second time you do it, but you dislike it less. And you dislike it even less the third time. Over time, you come to enjoy doing it. You come to feel the right way about it. Think about courage. The first time you ever had to stand up to someone, the first time you ever had to face any other kind of danger, your knees might have almost been shaking. But it gets easier the more you do it. Eventually, it might not ever be pleasant or fun to face danger, but eventually you won't be afraid in the way you were to start with. So Aristotle, he talks about habituation in the second book. Do the right thing over and over and over time, you'll come to feel the right way about it. And this gives him an interesting answer to Kant's objection. Kant would say, well, we can't control how we feel. So our emotions can't be part of how we define the good will. Aristotle, on the other hand, will say, over time, you kind of right. We can't in the moment flip a little switch in our head and feel what we ought to feel, but over time, through habituation, we can come to be the kind of people who feel the right way and do the right thing. And Aristotle would go even further. Aristotle would say, you can't, when you talk about doing duty for duty's sake, well, you're asking too little of people. You're recommending continence. The continent person is the person who does the right thing and might not feel the right way about it. If you do it just because it's your duty and you don't enjoy it, that is just continence. Continence, think back to our little list, is not the worst thing in the world. But we ought to aim for more than continence. We ought to aim for real virtue, or so says Aristotle. Okay, so hopefully you see how this talk of habituation and virtues leading people to feel the right way will help Aristotle to meet at least part of the challenge. Also, I think it's an interesting thing, to see how he meets this challenge that Kant poses. Okay, so as we get to the end of Aristotle's virtue theory next week, we'll see how Kant might answer this. For the time being, I just want you to see, how Aristotle would answer the Kantian argument we looked at earlier in the semester. Just to tip my hand a little bit, Aristotle will say that Kant sets the bar too low, or he would say, he never met Kant. He died way before Kant wrote. But I think he would say, and people who follow Aristotle now do say, Kantianism asks too little of us. Well, Kantians, on the other hand, are going to say Aristotle asks too much, that this is unrealistic. So we'll see why that is, next week when we get more deeply into Aristotle.